will not be biased. I will not be biased. I will get through this. I don't think I can. So before we continue with this video, allow me to get this out of my system, okay? Okay, Piastri's exit from Turn 1 didn't matter in the end, but it certainly left McLaren fans, including myself, shaking a little bit. Especially when the world saw Ferrari basically throw everything they possibly could at McLaren to get the best result possible, which in of itself was a valiant effort. McLaren are the Constructors Champions for the first time in 26 years. In fact, neither of their current drivers were alive the last time they did it. And Ferrari's efforts was valiant, and I really do applaud as an old school McLaren Ferrari fan in terms of competition. It wasn't quite enough. Sainz did give Norris a run for his money, and there were moments when he did close into within like a couple of seconds of Lando, but ultimately, Lando just had that little bit more left in the tank. And I recall a video going around on social media that, even though McLaren won out, they still congratulated Carlos as well, with a little sign on their pit board saying, "You're a big bull," meaning, I think, as people online are trying to speculate, is that they are congratulating Carlos for getting in the mix and helping Ferrari beat down Red Bull into third in terms of getting the well, like a matador or something. So that is really nice that they still remember Carlos fondly. Most of the time, the cameras were focusing on his teammate Oscar, despite being spun out by Max, still getting a lot of coverage, and then the misjudging of him around Colapinto, which caused the Argentinian to get a rear puncture with the 10-second penalty, trying to get back in the points. That was a more compelling story than Lando basically cruising at the front, relatively unopposed. So even though Oscar was relegated to no better than 10th, so at least he was able to get a point for McLaren, at least it did eliminate any funny business between the two of them trying to angle for the win. They might have taken each other out, and it would have been extremely awkward for Ferrari to win the Constructors in that way when McLaren had one hand on the crown and the trophy. And as for the car itself, it was surprisingly quick. Despite my predictions saying it would be in the mix with Ferrari and Verstappen, it turned out to be the class act of the entire field. All weekend it looked right up there. And this version of Lando seems a lot more composed after losing this year's championship, so perhaps next year might have more going for it after all. Excellent. Now, you might be thinking I should be jumping up for joy right now that McLaren have won this accolade despite missing out on the driver's title. And, you know, second place for Lando is still really, really good, as well as 4 victories in this first season where he's actually been gaining those wins. I am just simply too tired to think right now. It's been a real long slog. I just want to kind of just relax and just think about some content to do over the winter, okay? So yeah, let's move on. And despite missing out on the title, I've really got to give props to Ferrari as a winner here because they gave it their all. And speaking as a McLaren fan, this was a fun battle which went right to the end. Because even though McLaren did have the advantage, Ferrari were really good as well. And they managed to pull out all of the stops, and they had a relatively flawless race given all of the misfortune that befell Charles Leclerc. Not only did he get that 10th-place grid drop due to replacing his battery, he then misjudged the timings in Q2, which saw him out qualifying 14th and then starting 19th. And then, suddenly, it didn't really matter. And it makes you wonder, had he been right up there in the mix without that penalty and without that mix-up in Q2, he could have gone on to win that race, or at least really make Lando hustle for it. Charles Leclerc is probably one of the most consistent drivers on the grid, and had it been not for that mid-season slump, he might have been really close to taking it onto Max at the back end of this year. Makes you wonder, actually. And it does give people hope that fans of the monogas could really be looking to next year when Lewis Hamilton arrives and think, oh, actually, this could be a really interesting and spicy battle. As for Carlos, he did everything he could, and despite all the moments in his tenure with them where he took matters into his own hands, he was able to produce some good results, and the team should be proud of coming out this year with 5 wins, and a shot at some championship glory at all. Especially when you look back to where Ferrari were when Carlos arrived. So, even though people are a little bit mixed in terms of his overview and how he handles and is compatible with the Ferrari way, Carlos did his part. He helped turn things around alongside Charles, and even though they've had their scraps this year, it came away as a very solid driver relationship, sort of like Berger and Alesi in a way in the early 90s. It does provide some hope for Ferrari in the future. For a split second there, it looked like Ferrari could have turned it around. Had there been a problem and Norris got a penalty, or he had to retire the car, or had a bungle in the pit stop, they might have done it. They might have actually been able to convert that, and that would have been an absolute upset, and Italy would have exploded with excitement. They came close, though, and it got to within 14 points, so it wasn't like McLaren just stretched away and to make it a really insurmountable gap. No, this was almost a single-figure advantage McLaren had, and Ferrari, they were right there. And that old-school battle, I love it. But Charles Leclerc, my goodness, he was absolutely on fire. Luck has certainly been better for him this year, and when it hasn't been, the driver's been able to race above it. It was a worthy fight with no complications befalling the Italian team at all, and hey, it was nice to see his brother Arthur alongside him in FP1, you know, two brothers at the same team. I just wish F1 didn't milk it as much as they did. Okay, if there were a reason why Carlos couldn't have actually raced in Abu Dhabi this weekend, and they brought in Arthur Leclerc, although I would really doubt it considering the stakes, that would have been epic news, that two brothers would have been racing for the same team, for Ferrari of all people, and then the father of both Arthur and Charles could look down and see, well, all of the work and all of the efforts that he put into both of their careers, it got to them racing for Ferrari together. That was a really poignant moment, but it was kind of spoiled by saying, brothers, teammates, in an FP1 session. Yeah, okay. It was still nice to see, but it wasn't that big of a deal, but it was still nice. And then there's Pierre Gasly. Sure, it wasn't another top 5 finish, but you got to look at the situation at hand here. Since Brazil, Pierre has netted a total of 3/4 of his total points tally for the entire season. That, by the way, is enough for him to leapfrog past Lance Stroll, past Nico Hülkenberg, past Yuki Tsunoda, for Gasly to end up in 10th place in the Drivers' Championship. Let's put this into further context. This is one of his best positions in the Drivers' title standings in his entire career. He managed to match his placement in 2020, where he got his first and so far only win, and I think he's only had a couple of other years. 2023, he actually finished 11th, so after all the stuff that's happened this year, Pierre has ended up in a better position than he was last year before the start of this season happened, and it was absolutely terrible. Talk about swings and roundabouts, eh? And also, in hopes for Alpine next year, he was fighting compellingly so with Russell and Verstappen for quite a bit. And even though it didn't work out for him and a podium was just too far away for Alpine right now, this was a relatively quiet race where they could actually do something with that car. Alpine were thrown a bone thanks to that 3-place grid drop that Nico got due to all of that awkward traffic management that he had. It was a real shame because there could have been a situation, one scenario out there, that Nico might have had a chance for a podium. And that would have really made Alpine's struggle for P6 all the harder. But hey, they got lucky and Gasly is simply on a roll. It makes me think that maybe next year, he could be really, really good. Then there's Mercedes. We've got to mention them, because not only did Mercedes defy the critics, which included myself, and net both cars in the top 5, but Lewis Hamilton himself had a spirited fight back like Leclerc, his future teammate, and came back from 16th to 4th, with him having just enough of the tank to pass George Russell in the last lap. And also, most importantly, easily, between those two teammates, Lewis can have the last laugh, because in terms of total points scored in the 3 seasons they worked together, Lewis just came out ahead of George by 2 points. And you can still interpret a lot of things about that, but ultimately, numbers-wise, Lewis was better. Although in terms of the driver standing head-to-head, George actually won 2-1. But hey, swings and roundabouts again, and it just goes to show that George, there is a lot of potential in that guy. And it also goes to show that Lewis still has something left in the tank, and it could be further energized when he goes to Ferrari, because as he said, he looks good in red. And the celebrations that Lewis had, I'm glad that this happened, and even though he wasn't on the podium, at least he got to join them. Sure, it's not like Lewis was retiring or anything like that, but this is just such a huge sea change. A lot of you out there who have been watching F1 for a long time do not understand the impact of what's going on here, because you've got to look at it from a younger perspective. Because there are Formula 1 fans out there who have only known Lewis at Mercedes, and now that time is over. This is a monumental moment for any young F1 fan. It's absolutely ridiculous how this is such an end of an era, because you've got to look at what Lewis was able to do. He was on the alternate strategy, he got to do some hammer time, and he was in contention, as Bono might have predicted, for 3rd place. And it wasn't that far away. They weren't that far off, but Charles simply just had too much for Lewis to be able to overcome from his grid position of 16th. Had things been different and they kept that alternate strategy and Lewis was maybe at the top end of Q2, bottom of Q3, it could have been 3rd quite handily. So yeah, that was nice. As for George, he did hold firm, and even though the off-track drama has seen his public awareness grow but also become more divisive regarding his beef with Max Verstappen, he was able to hold on to the top 5 amidst Red Bull's own struggles, which isn't terrible, but it was clear that Hamilton today was the stronger of the two drivers. The car, the W15, has actually turned itself around and is actually relatively decent in most climates, actually. So here's hoping that come Melbourne next year, they are in the mix with Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull, that there are 4 teams in contention for the championship. If we had 5 teams, my goodness, no one would know where anybody would come in the scoring range. And speaking of a 5th team, if it were Aston Martin, Alonso deserves a place here, because not only did he get a P9 and get some more points for Aston Martin, but it turns out that Fernando has been racing with an injured shoulder ever since the aftermath of the Brazilian Grand Prix. Because those shots of him having help getting out of the car, that was a lot more serious than first suspected. That wasn't just exhaustion, he was badly injured. Gotta remember here, this guy's 43 years old. He's been carrying this injury, and even though it's probably not as bad as it was in Interlagos, it's still there, and he's able to hustle that car, which deservedly at points was one of the slowest cars on the grid, into 9th place, holding off a McLaren of all things. That is really a good effort, and sure, Hulkenberg was quite some ways away, so anything higher than 9th would have been a bit wishful thinking. But Aston Martin, where they are right now, and how Lance Stroll has struggled, that is something to be really, really happy about, and it's just absolutely wild how Fernando can still do this, and has now bagged 2 points finishes consecutively, meaning Aston Martin has something to hope for going into the winter. Just imagine what's going to be happening when Adrian Newey walks through the door, their first day as colleagues. I bet Fernando's going to be giving him a big hug and go, right, let's go for 33. Then we get to the section, and despite not securing any points for the team thanks to what seems to be a tricky clutch, destroying his start and then making his exit from his pit stop a sobering situation, Yuki managed to come out of the season having bested both of his teammates, giving Red Bull plenty of things to think about in this post-Abu Dhabi shareholder meeting, if they are actually going to be thinking about replacing Checo. And you all know my stance about this. You might be thinking that I'm biased in this situation, but you've just got to look at the facts, the statistics. Yuki deserves to have a go, even if it's just for 1 year, for that last season with Red Bull and Honda working together. Then after that, whatever, Liam can take that seat. Just 1 year, give him a chance. He's done the time. And despite the fact that the Racing Bulls car is simply just not up there with Alpine or Haas or anything like that, Yuki was still able to at least give some of the front-running cars a bit of trouble when they were trying to overtake him. He even actually had a little encounter with Pierre, and that was a bit of a fun battle. It just makes you wonder. He might have been in contention for points had he been able to start and continue around about 11th, which is what his qualifying slot was, but he still was able to outshine the likes of Liam Lawson, although he had his own problems, and I'll get to that later. But it just sums up that this team that Yuki is part of, they got a lot of things to fix over the winter after their equal fall with Aston Martin post-Imola. And unlike Aston, they've been able to turn around. At least with Racing Bulls, no. They've managed to find something, the green team. The blue and white team, nah. Their strategic blunders do not help either. And another benefactor to Hulkenberg's drop to 7th on the grid was one Jack Doohan, albeit indirectly. Because I did find it extremely weird that in the middle of a battle for 6th in the Constructors, with Magnussen fired up, and with Hulkenberg getting onto the provisional 2nd row of the grid, that why would they put in a rookie when they need to score as many points as possible? Because Ocon would have had relatively equal machinery to Pierre. He might have been able to convert it into points. But ultimately though, with that drop to 7th, Jack was let off the hook somewhat because Pierre was able to control things and manage what Haas would be able to do. They could respond to him. And then Magnussen had his own problems, so that means Jack could easily learn without any pressure or exposure, and he actually held himself up really nicely. Even though he qualified last, he was actually able to end the race alongside everybody else with competitive times. This is a positive bit of feedback going into the following year, and also probably a little bit of pressure taken off his shoulders, considering that he would have been starting in Melbourne. That would have been his debut race, his home weekend. That would have been a lot to deal with. So this will be his 2nd race, a little bit less. Not by much, but it's something. And who knows, Alpine's uptick might lead to him maybe getting a Q2 cameo and a touching points opportunity, perhaps. I just hope this performance has done enough to at least put those 5-race contract rumours to bed for at least a little bit. At least in hibernation. He didn't disgrace himself, and that's a good thing. Not bad at all. And going back to Hulkenberg, you know what? I think that could have been a podium-worthy performance. 4th on the grid, on merit, in a Haas. It's just such a shame that he just made that mistake with traffic management, stopping in the pit lane on the exit. It just saw the stewards spoil our fun. And in the midst of all of the stuff going on between Verstappen and Piastri, at one point, Nico could have been in 3rd. And even though Charles Leclerc might have overtaken him in the end, just having that amount of clear air and being away from all of that traffic might have allowed Nico to get into a groove and then maybe hang in there with Lando and Carlos for a little bit and be able to have an opportunity of being in the top 5 and get one of his best results for Haas with his last opportunity with the team. Sadly, it was wasted due to that lapse in judgment and just mistake. But we got to look into perspective here. Like with Williams between 22 and 23, going from 10th to 7th, that is still a huge boost in capital and opportunities and glory. It's still something to be pleased with, but 6th, it was in contention and it would have been even better. But hey ho, third time swings and roundabouts. And you've also got to remember, I think this guy's now the third oldest driver on the grid, and he's still bringing home points at a consistent rate. He's not slowing down. And having gotten the second chance in F1, he's just as fired up as Alonso, if not more so. And whilst people might have been thinking, his 3-year contract with Sauber, oh, it's going to be the death knell of his career, what a whimpering way to end his time in F1. I'm not so sure now, because I think with Jonathan Wheatley coming in as the team principal from Red Bull, and then Binotto working in the background, I think this Sauber team could be not all that bad next year. I'm not expecting them to be consistent points finishers, but neither do I think they're going to be locked to the back for the majority of the year. They've been going through a lot of growing pains this season, and Nico's not had to be there right in the middle of it. Unfortunately, Bottas and Zhou have been subject to that, but Nico might be able to gain from a lot of that, as well as the now-crowned F2 champion Bortoletto. So I expect a little more in terms of green shoots from that team, but as for Nico with Haas, this was a really good way to finish things. It could have been even better though, but still, not too shabby from Nico to recover to 8th or something. Then there is Max Verstappen. I am going to put my biases aside here, despite the fact he massacred my boy into turn 1, and we've got to remember that even though his car was not good in Q3, he still had an electric start, and it could have easily made him into second position by turn 1's ending. He still wanted to try and go after Lando and be in the mix with Carlos maybe. This could have been him on the podium with that really good start. It was so good. It was just a shame that it was curtailed and it compromised my boy. But easy going, easy going. You just still got to remember, he was still motivated. He still had something to go for. That is something to commend. And he relatively kept things clean after that. He was relatively quiet, and yeah, I think there was really not much he could do, despite the fact that he had a 10-second penalty to deal with. He probably sustained a little bit of damage, but he was still competitive somewhat. I just wish he didn't go on the radio talking about, oh, give me 20 seconds, stupid idiots. It was just a bit like, really? He didn't have to mention that. It was unnecessary. It's only going to cause negative press to be had about you. I groaned rather than complained about that, but you know what? I don't think Max cares. He had his effective stepdaughter Penelope there with him. He's about to become a dad himself with Kelly. He's got 4 titles under his belt with over 60 wins to his name. Life's good. And he's going to probably spend Christmas with his family quietly away from the media. He doesn't care how he's portrayed for the next couple of months, no. And despite many people in the media thinking he's now starting to start beef with Oscar going into 2025, you are sorely mistaken. Now, you know me. I am one of Piastri's biggest fanboys right here, and I could easily be going like, how dare Max go after Piastri? Oh, there's going to be beef between them. Well, no, that didn't happen, because he went to apologize to Oscar straight away as soon as he could, and he then said in interviews that the last person he wanted to get into a tangle with was Oscar, which does tell me there is an indicator of real respect there, that he's got no gripe with Oscar, he wants to fight him cleanly, and that maybe there is a real sense of guilt for having curtailed his own race as well, considering there was nothing to fight for Max. So that is a really interesting reaction from Verstappen. Maybe if they actually got to fight each other in equal cars for a championship, maybe it could be really spicy, but also relatively clean. Because Oscar didn't get into a flap. He was actually kind of sarcastic about, move a world champion, I suppose. And then he just sort of shrugged it off. He didn't start any beef. He didn't want to, like, get anything provoked. And it was all done. It was all done really quickly. Unlike with what happened with Russell. And also, I did find it really surprising that the stewards actually decided to hand him a 10-second penalty, considering that usually, as we've gotten accustomed to, a turn 1, lap 1 incident, that usually gets the benefit of the doubt as a racing incident and nothing more. It's what we saw in Qatar with Hulkenberg taking out Colapinto and Ocon. Nico didn't get a penalty there, whereas Max did. So maybe there is an indication of bias to some extent, and, you know, Oscar did get some karma by ruining Colapinto's race to some extent, but still, that's just something to think about. I think the days of lap 1, turn 1 incidents going with a pass, I think they're over now, because these bunch of stewards, they're going to be stricter. I'm not mad at Max, I'm just frustrated that Oscar didn't get a chance to try for the win. Oh well. And then we get to the losers, the opposite of winners, and we may as well start with Checo, given the hubbub surrounding his future, and this race meaning that he finishes the year with 2 DNFs to his name. Albeit this one was no fault of his own after a tangle with Bottas spun him out, eliminating any chance of him coming in with some points. And basically eliminating any opportunity for him to turn things around and try and score some points, although it probably would have been in the bottom half of the top 10, considering that he started, well, 10th. He's therefore got little to really try and justify his case, because the last 2 races, even though there was potential to be in the top 10, it ultimately wasn't to be through retirements, either through mechanical failure or through scraps with other drivers. And realistically, you should also be thinking, well, Checo in that car should not be where he is, because as has been said many times, if you're at the front, it's relatively clean and sedate. You ideally want to be there. But if you're in the mix in the midfield, where all these teams are scrabbling for 9th and 10th, you are going to be with drivers who have got less to lose, and therefore these accidents can happen. And then Checo claims that he might have been doomed anyway, with the car suspected of having some kind of gearbox fault or power issue fault, but we can't have confirmation of that for the moment because it's not available. And amidst all of the off-track turmoil surrounding the potential standoff between Red Bull and its Mexican driver, this could be a really sorry end to the story of Perez with Red Bull. It just remains to be seen. It's a real shame though, because in the midst of Max Verstappen spinning out, getting the 10-second penalty, just maybe outscore his teammate and come out on top for once since the opening times in Miami, or even back in 2023. It was just such an open goal, but it wasn't taken, and it was curtailed by the likes of Bottas on Perez, and that's really sad, but that's just the way it is in Formula 1 sometimes. Same goes for Kevin as well, albeit he at least secured the fastest lap in his final race like Daniel Ricciardo did for VCARB, and at least Kevin got to have a proper goodbye for the team that he basically spent most of his F1 career with, and it's not like he's got nothing to do after this. Because it is important to point out, he is going to be having a works deal with BMW in endurance racing next year, so that is something to really look forward to, as well as more quality time with his family. So that's a nice little compromise for Kevin. And then at the same time, you've really got to consider that after he came back from his race ban, Kevin's been on fire. It's probably because he doesn't really have that many cares in the world. He doesn't care if he gets penalty points because he's not having to serve anything. He doesn't have to worry about a race ban or anything because he's going to be gone. And he had a really good start as well. I think he went from 14th to 7th. So there could have been a double points finish, and maybe they might have been able to do enough to turn things around with the likes of Alpine and Gasly, but ultimately it wasn't to be because Magnussen had some issues. He then had a tangle with Bottas, which led to damage to his side pod. He then had to go on the soft tyres, so he was near the back. So therefore, there wasn't really much he could do. So he was sort of screwed. But hey, at least he was able to entertain the crowd. And in Qatar, we managed to get him throwing expletives on the radio. And everyone, instead of just recoiling in horror, everyone's going like, "Yay, Kevin's back!" He went out with a flair, albeit not as explosive as his old-time teammate Roman. And then there's Liam Lawson. Much like with Checo, this was probably not the race he would want to cap off his second substitution period for the second Red Bull team with, because like Checo, the majority of his grief was not through his own actions, but by factors that weren't his fault. You know, such as the front left not being put on properly, albeit it was very, very, very subtle. I barely saw it, but it happened. It meant that he had to come in to fix it. He then got that 10-second stop-go penalty, so that put him really at the back, because I think at one point he was in contention for 7th or something like that, so he could have had an opportunity to outscore Yuki Tsunoda and maybe have the last laugh in terms of that battle and have a really good case for him to be next to Max next year. But then his car conked out on him and he had a mechanical DNF, so it just really led to an unfortunate race with opportunities wasted due to car issues. Because now I think Yuki's outpaced Liam 6-0, so this is something to be taking into consideration for that talk. And Liam, I just feel like the second substitution period has not been as bombastic as the first one. Although having said that though, going second time around, it's like the tricky second album. He would have had to have scored maybe 8ths and 7ths or something like that. Nope. Ultimately though, Zhou has now finished ahead of him in the championship. So that's something to take note of as well. And like Liam said at the beginning of his tenure with Racing Bulls for this year, he only had a 6-race contract, so now he's out of the contract for next year. So his future is now in the hands of Helmut Marko, Christian Horner, Lauren Mekies, Peter Baer, and the Red Bull Racing shareholders. So his future now remains just as precarious as the likes of Sergio Perez, who he did have argy-bargy with this season. So it's going to be an awkward meeting. We'll find out soon enough. Then, unfortunately, Sauber. It was less fortuitous than last time out at Qatar, but there was a flicker of hope for Bottas with him getting into Q3 quite handily and on for points, until he basically had one of the scrappiest races of his entire career. A lap 1 incident, then he had contact with Magnussen later on, which led to a puncture of his own and broken track rod, and then a mechanical retirement. So, yeah, there was an opportunity for Bottas to maybe get something out of this, but this time around, it wasn't necessarily to do with the car, like it was at the beginning of the year, because the car is showing some promise, and Zhou had some opportunities to turn things around. He managed to actually increase from 17th to 13th, so that is something that is to have some hope for 2025 with. but Zhou himself really couldn't do much, but he did at least manage to finish within the mix instead of being right at the back, like we have seen many times this season. But yeah, Bottas, this wasn't a good time of it, and now he's actually been brandishing the last 2 years of his 3-year contract with the Hinwil team as a mistake. Oh dear. So basically he said the only good year that he had was when Fred Vasseur was there. He was sold the dream of being with Fred, and then he left, and then the Seidel-Key relationship with Aluni Bravi there, that was terrible. And then Binotto and Audi might have been able to turn things around, but it does make me think maybe Bottas should have been focusing on trying to get a deal with another team, like Williams, get that deal done, instead of trying desperately to hang on with Audi, because maybe he saw things turn around with Binotto there, but unfortunately though, Hülkenberg and Bortoleto will benefit from it. Maybe he will get that Mercedes deal after all, and maybe he might serve some purpose with Kimi Antonelli. I don't know. I'm not exactly a mind reader, but I have hope. I'm sure that Toto will want some sort of continuity from the good old days of Hamilton and Bottas to be able to impart some wisdom. And unfortunately, Colapinto is going to have an enforced break of his own. And it was a really sad way for things to end, because not only does Franco have another DNF, but a potentially interesting race was ended by Piastri, who did make a mistake and led to that puncture of the Argentinian. But what's important to remember here is that Franco, and to some extent Alex, were running cars with very, very, very old parts, which probably means for him to be able to get into any points was practically impossible. And for Alex, even though he got 11th and at one point he was in the points, it was still very, very tricky. They only had one spare front nose to be able to go between them, so they were really pushing for parts. And then Colapinto retired due to a suspected power unit issue, although I kinda doubt it. I think maybe Williams wants to make sure they have as much parts as possible for the young driver test and the filming day today, where Carlos Sainz is going to be taking part with Williams with his first day working for the Oxfordshire-based team. So don't blow anything up, because they probably got nothing left after this week. After that, it doesn't really matter. They can throw all of their parts in the bin. They can start again next year, because it's been a really high attrition season for this team. It's ridiculous. But Colapinto, he did the best he could. He scored points for the team, and now it's up to Williams where he goes in the next couple of years. So remains to be seen. Because yes, that is indeed it. Another season is done. I will be having some more content over the winter break as best as I can. I'll figure something out. I may take some breaks here or there, but don't worry, I'm not going away, because I want to see if I can get to 100,000 subscribers before the start of next year. So if you are watching and you're not yet subscribed, please do so, because I will try and make sure that you are not left bored and left wanting for content over the next few months, because we are going to have to try and stick together to try and get through this. I will also include a winners and losers video for the entire year instead of a specific race, so I'll ponder about the other things that have been going on throughout 2024, including the supposed future of Alpine and how I believe it's had a secret takeover go down, and it could yield more clues as to its future destiny. To find out why I think there is a conspiracy going on at Team Instant, go and watch this video next. I'm really proud of it, and I think it'll be quite enlightening, so I'll see you over there.